is our agenda, and I'm just going to briefly touch on what we're going to be covering. First, we'll talk a little bit about the rules. We'll cover inline XBRL and cover page tagging, of course, and we'll have a discussion about the various rules and how they work and what the SEC has seen. Our speakers will be Chase Bongiorno. Chase is Principal Product Manager at Topan Merrill. And we'll have Mike Willis. Mike is Assistant Director in the Office of Structured Disclosure, Division of Economic Risk and Analysis at the SEC. We'll then go on to some CPE questions, and then we'll move to what's changed, what's not with the new ruling. And Brian Chavez. Brian is Product Owner at Donnelly Financial Services. He's going to take us through that. Next, we'll cover hidden facts and duplicates, and that will be Anna Kwok. Anna is Vice President of Professional Services at Workiva. And then finally, we'll have transformations, exclusions, continuations, and dimensions. And this will be covered by Steve Horowitz. Steve is Manager of Technical Services and Web Applications at NovaWorks. And then finally, sorry, we do have another section on best practices. And Brian Chavez will come back in and cover that as well. We'll take a couple of CPE questions at the end. So make sure that you stay to the end if you are getting CPE credit, because it's important that you respond to the questions so that you can get your certificate. So I'm also going to mention that there are a number of resources, and Mike Willis has kindly given us links to a number of different resources that the SEC is offering, including interpretations on interactive data from the Division of Corporation Finance and Division of Corporation Finance, also the Division of Investment Management's Investment Company Report Modernization FAQ. The Office of Structured Disclosure provides guidance in their mutual fund risk return taxonomy preparer's guide. They also have an inline XBRL page. There's also the Edgar Filer manual, of course. They provide guidance, and then this is the email address that every preparer and vendor should feel comfortable using to reach the SEC. We also have a number of free resources available from XBRL US and our members. We have the data quality rules, we have an archive of webinars, and we also have ongoing live webinars. We have our SEC reporting page, legislative and regulatory activities, and then we also posted some information on COVID-19 relief for filers. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Chase Bongiorno, who's going to talk us through the rule.
Thanks, Michelle. My name is Chase Bongiorno. I'm the Principal Product Manager at Topan Merrill. I'm also the Chair of the Communication Steering Committee here at XBRL US. Before we jump into our discussion with Mike, I thought I'd cover some important context. Let's break the SEC's iXBRL rules into two buckets. In the first bucket, the SEC rolled out iXBRL to operating companies in June of last year. Now, this June, accelerated filers will be required to submit financials in inline XBRL, starting with the fiscal period ending. Oh,
sorry,
yes,
sorry to interrupt, but I've given you control of the screen so that you can share your screen now.
Thanks, Michelle. Hopefully my screen's coming through clearly now on the Zoom.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right, well, as I mentioned, the SEC's iXBRL rules can be broken into two buckets, one for operating companies and one for funds. Sorry, I had a little Zoom issue there. For the folks on this call, the accelerated filer deadline will begin to submit financials in inline XBRL starting June 15th for fiscal period. This means that 10-Qs dated 6/30 will need iXBRL tagging unless you are a smaller reporting company or an FPI. Now, next summer, all remaining filers will be required to submit financials in an inline iXBRL format. Some other changes have happened regardless of phase. The probably most noticeable one for filers is the website posting requirement has been eliminated. So that's one that I get questions about personally pretty often. The second bucket, of course, is our mutual fund filers. Now, the implementation for mutual funds is on a slightly different timetable. It's broken into two groups. one for large fund groups. That's with funds that have $1 billion in net assets or more. Now, that will be effective on registration statements filed on or after September 17th of 2020. If you're a small fund group, of course, that would be a fund group with less than $1 billion in net assets, registration statements effective on or after September 17th, 2021 will require the iXBRL tagging. Perfect. I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about the FAST Act. Now, the FAST Act was passed by Congress in 2017, and the SEC rolled out their associated rules in 2018. The SEC rules relating to the FAST Act really cover cover page tagging. You can see the forms that are impacted listed below, but perhaps the most noticeable is the 10K, the 10Q, and of course, 8Ks. Now, the FAST Act implementation time period mirrors the iXBRL phase-in we just discussed, with large accelerated filers already in compliance, accelerated filers complying this summer, and all others next summer. All right, a few more kind of important points for context for my discussion with Mike regarding the FAST Act. The first is that annual reports have added a trading symbol field to the cover page, and periodic reports have added the field pictured in the middle of the slide here. You can see there's a bit more meat on it, including trading symbol and name of exchange where it's registered. Another kind of important change was the Exhibit 104. The SEC has added a requirement to reference the cover page's interactive data file. Now, this is a great point for me to kind of remind everyone what Michelle said. If you have specific questions, please use the chat. All of the presenters, including Mike and myself, will be going through and trying to answer the questions in the chat as they pop up. So as I make this, as I have this discussion with Mike, should any questions come up, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. We want to be here to help you.
Hey, Chase, just one point. It's probably best to put them in the Q&A. Click on the Q&A on the screen as opposed to the chat. And that'll be the quickest way for us to make sure that we get them answered.
Thanks, Michelle. Important Zoom clarification. All right, well, so the review of the rules provides some helpful context for my discussion with our guest, Mike Willis. Mike is the Assistant Director of the Office of Structured Data at DERA in the SEC. Previously, Mike was a Big Four audit partner at PwC. Mike, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to join. I know you have an important disclaimer you have to read before we jump into our questions.
I do, Chase, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate today. But these are the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, as a matter of policy, disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement by any of its employees. The views expressed today are mine and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or of my colleagues at the Commission. So Chase, over to you.
Perfect, thanks. We've compiled a list of questions based on feedback I know I've gotten from filers and input from some of the other presenters on the call. So if you have specific questions, one more time, please be sure to put them in the Q&A, not the chat box, and we'll follow up as soon as possible. All right, Mike, let's dive right in. The first question actually comes from a smaller reporting company, and they want to know, what does it mean to early adopt iXBRL compliance? Mike?
So early adoption may reference the inline XBRL voluntary program, and that allows registrants to file using the inline XBRL format prior to their respective inline XBRL mandatory compliance dates. Now, the voluntary inline filing program was established by the June 2016 exemptive order, and it was extended by the 2018 inline XBRL adopting release. And both of those enabled vendors and their filing agents to gain experience that may help facilitate transition to XBRL inline for filers adopting inline XBRL at a later time, at their mandatory time. What it means is that filers can take advantage of some of the process and control benefits that are enabled by the inline XBRL format, and those would include things like the disclosure checklist, content referencing, time series charting of company disclosures, benchmarking of peer disclosures, redlining of prior period narrative disclosures, the application of the data quality rules that Michelle mentioned earlier, and identification of common data quality errors within the report. Chase?
Perfect, thanks, Mike. I guess a related question, if an issuer were to early adopt, would they also need to comply with the FAST Act cover page requirements and some of those other regulatory requirements you just mentioned?
Yeah, under the voluntary inline program, filers can start and stop their filing using inline XBRL at any time and as many times as they choose. just as long as it's prior to their respective compliance mandatory dates. So the cover page tagging is sort of a separate requirement and not required for voluntary inline XBRL filers. However, the implementation calendar for the cover page tagging, it aligns directly with the inline XBRL adopting release and is staggered for filers over the 3 years, with the large accelerated filers last year, accelerated filers this year, and everybody else next year. So filers may also early elect to tag their cover page on their Form 8Ks using inline XBRL prior to their first Form 10Q. However, they're not required to do so.
If they didn't go that route, can they change their mind?
Yes, as many times as they want, back and forth, do whatever they want, just as long as they do it prior to their mandatory filing date.
Oh, great. All right, well, switching gears a bit, regarding the FAST Acts cover page tagging requirements, does it apply to all 8Ks or just some once you're in compliance?
Yeah, cover page tagging applies to any Form 8K submitted by a reporting entity once their inline XBRL compliance date occurs. Additionally, the cover page tagging applies to all Forms 10K, 10Q, 20F, and 40F, but for those last two forms, only if they're being used for annual reports and not being used as a registration statement. Maybe to wrap up, the cover page tagging requirements do not apply to non-operating companies such as investment companies, business development companies, or asset-backed issuers.
Okay, great. That's helpful, Mike. Thank you. The next question relates to companies that were not required to have financials tagged in iXBRL. Now, do they get an exemption or do they have to comply just like all the others?
Yeah, for operating companies that were previously not required to have their financials tagged using inline XBRL, the cover page tagging requirements align directly with the requirements to use the inline XBRL format. So those companies should start tagging the cover page for their Form 10Q and their Form 10K when those forms are also submitted or required to be submitted in the inline XBRL format.
Makes sense. All right. Can you spend a few moments explaining the difference between Exhibits 101 and Exhibit 104? Specifically, where are they used?
Sure, good question. Exhibit 101 is required to be filed with any inline XBRL submission. Exhibit 101 contains the structured disclosures within the filing. Exhibit 104 is required to be filed with any cover page submission tagged in inline XBRL, and it must be included as part of the Exhibit 101. Now, that said, the Exhibit 104 should be referenced in an EDGAR submission if the filing document contains an exhibit index. Forms that do not include an exhibit index do not need to reference Exhibit 104. As an example, some Form 8Ks require the inclusion of an exhibit index, and other Form 8Ks do not require the inclusion of exhibit index.
Thanks, Mike. And I see some chat questions coming in. I promise as we go through the Q&A, we'll get to those. I know the difference between Exhibit 104 and 101 has sparked some discussion among the participants.
Yep.
So related then, what happens if an issuer has already filed an iXBRL doc that does not reference Exhibit 104?
Simple. The filer should add the Exhibit 104 reference in their next inline XBRL filing.
In the next inline XBRL filing. Okay,
Yep.
That's good information. I'm just going to keep the questions coming, Mike. Should filers reference Exhibit 104 in 8Ks as well?
Yeah, Exhibit 104 should be referenced in an EDGAR submission if the filing document contains an exhibit index. So again, forms that do not include an exhibit index do not need to reference Exhibit 104. As I said earlier, some 8Ks require an exhibit index and others do not require an exhibit index. So it depends.
Makes sense. All right. So I guess we're going to stick with this 8K question because we have a lot of activity on the Q&A regarding our 8Ks. So what should be included in a Form 8K when there are other exhibits attached?
It's pretty simple. Well, the company should include a reference to the Exhibit 104 where there are other exhibits attached. For example, it could say very simply, and I would quote here, 104 cover page interactive data file, paren, embedded within the inline XBRL document, close paren. So something very short, very direct. That's all you need.
Short, sweet, and to the point. I like it. I like it. All right. Well, Mike, do you want to add some context then to this inline tag 8K example we have on the screen?
Sure. I think maybe I discussed this earlier, but the cover page tagging compliance dates are aligned with the reporting requirements. Maybe, Chase, could you go to the next question and let's come back to this? I'm not sure where we are in the questions.
Sure, sure. We'll jump back to this one, no problem.
Sure.
So on the next slide, we have an example of the exhibit references that you were just mentioning. Maybe you want to talk us through this.
Yeah, sure. So what we're showing here is an example of where that's included as an exhibit. And it would just show up like I mentioned earlier, just include a very simple statement. I think the cover page tagging compliance dates are aligned with the fiscal periods. They start in June last year. Accelerated filers start this year. So I think that's probably enough to cover on this, Chase. I'm not sure.
I think so. We'll see what comes in the Q&A, and if there are some additional questions, we can always circle back or answer those directly in the Q&A. All right. Well, let's shift gears here. We've talked a lot about 8Ks and cover page tagging. Let's talk about amendments now. If an issuer is amending a prior filing that has occurred before they adopted iXBRL, does that amendment now need cover page tagging? And I can tell you this is a pretty common question we in the financial print business get.
Yeah, so the cover page compliance dates align directly with the inline dates. So as a result of that, any subsequent amendments to a prior fiscal year report are not required to be updated using the current period report tagging requirements. Okay, so you would use the tagging requirements that were in place at the point of the prior issuance. So registrants are required, though, to submit reports in a format appropriate for the filing period, although they may adopt inline XBRL earlier than required. Now, that said, the cover page tagging requirements for reports previously required to be submitted in the inline XBRL format should also be resubmitted in the inline XBRL format when subsequently amended. So if they're required to be an inline, the amendment needs to be an inline. Otherwise, they should use the format that was used in the original filing.
Makes sense. Let's dig in a little more and say we take that same scenario, but we assume that they're only amending non-financial data, for example, the MD&A. Is the answer the same?
Yeah, it's the same.
Great, great. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. This is a very interesting topic, one that's near and dear to my heart with my own kind of personal background, but relating to filers who have 12G and or 12B securities registered, perhaps you can share some best practices. We know this is a common question XBRL US has been getting, and we do have an example we can kind of share on the screen as well. Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is specifically in the Edgar Filer Manual. So if you're looking for it, I think it's in EFM 6.05.46, and it relates to the security of 12B, title security, 12G, title exclusive. What's going on here is you're putting two different names into the same XBRL context. Encourage you to put them in different contexts to distinguish by share class access. There is an example in the Filer Manual. It starts with the sentence, quote, "A company with multiple classes of security uses additional context to distinguish the data about them." Again, that's in EFM 6.5.46. Now, that said, Chase, if you or anybody else has a question about this, it would be very helpful to provide that example or that scenario directly to us at structureddata@sec.gov. Send us a screenshot, send us a picture, explain what's going on, the problem you're having, and we can respond to you directly and get you an answer. Again, structureddata@sec.gov.
Thanks, Mike. And that's pretty important context. I know as filers, it's often a little bit intimidating to reach out to the SEC, but having done so myself, they're nice folks that work over there, always try to get back to you whatever information they have available. All right. I want to switch gear and talk a little bit more about cover page tagging, but this time about jurisdictions. So for filers with multiple jurisdictions, what's the proper way to tag the states? And I'll put an example here on the screen so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. This example company has the state of jurisdiction listed as both Texas and Virginia.
Yeah, this is a great example. So let's kind of step back and look at the cover page field. It's defined as, quote, the state or other jurisdiction of incorporation or organization. And as such, it should reflect the registrant's legal entity state of incorporation. Now, the Edgar Filer Manual also includes a jurisdiction of incorporation or organization, and it displays the jurisdiction in which the business is registered. Okay, so for this example, the legal entity was originally incorporated in Texas, and then subsequently it was also incorporated in another state. But the registrant Edgar CIK profile is the single source of the issue. And the CIK profile only enables a single state to be referenced. In this case, it's Texas. So the filers should maintain their company data in Edgar in their profile, and that data includes a state of incorporation field that only accommodates one value or one state. And it shows up like this, exactly the way you're showing on the screen now. And that's sort of the key to this. So it would be sensible for filers to ensure that the code used to generate, the code used agrees with the code present in inline's XBRL filing required context. It just makes sense for those two to snap up together. And if they don't, you're probably going to get some kind of warning or error message.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. So, if filers have a question, they can always just check their Edgar profile at sec.gov or contact their financial partner.
Yep.
Awesome.
And to use the one that's in their CIK profile.
All right. I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that there were two big boxes we were going to talk about. So let's shift and talk about mutual funds. I know we have quite a few folks asking questions in the Q&A specifically related to mutual funds. So I think these next few questions might be a bit more relevant and might actually answer some of the Q&A items. The first involves R tags. I know this has been a hot topic in the SEC filer community as of late. R tags will cause invalid iXBRL. So for those filers early adopting the inline rule, can they file without applying R tags?
Yes, they can, and they should. So can filers early adopt inline without applying the R tag? Yes, you can, and you should. Please skip the redlining and just submit the inline XBRL filer as you want it to be. It will be disseminated, no problem. And when there's an Edgar feature to support the R tag, great. But until then, you can submit it without it.
Great, that's very helpful, Mike. And I know that will probably spur some companies to potentially early adopt. As I mentioned kind of in the intro, there's a 15-day grace period for mutual funds that's going away with the iXBRL requirement. So if a filer was to early adopt, can they still take advantage of that 15-day grace period?
It's really up to the filer. So if the registrant voluntarily uses inline in advance of their mandatory compliance day, they may or they may not take advantage of the 15-day filing period. It's up to them. It's up to the registrant. They can do it either way. This flexibility really should enable a more timely compliance when the mandatory timing is required. So we're really leaving it up to the registrant, trying to encourage early attempts at inline so that when the mandatory time comes, they're sort of ready for it. That's the whole purpose there.
Okay, great. That makes sense. So I think this is all the questions I see relating to mutual funds. So Mike, let me take a moment and say thank you for joining us today. I know you're very busy, and given the current circumstances, I do appreciate you joining and answering these questions. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Michelle Savage at iXBRL US. Michelle, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Again, Chase, thanks for having me. Michelle, appreciate it.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Mike and Chase. That was really helpful. And we do have a lot of questions that came in, and I think Mike has been kind enough to indicate that he's going to try to take a look at some of those questions and answer the ones that he can. And then if we have time, we'll try to get to some of those at the end. But so right now I am going to share my screen again, and I'm going to try to share just the slides. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm now going to turn over to Brian Chavez. Brian is going to address what's changed and what's not, which obviously is pretty critical. So Brian?
Thank you, Michelle. All right, so what has changed and what has not? I'm going to first give a high-level summary of what has changed with iXBRL and what hasn't, and then we'll dive deep into the best practices for the iXBRL changes. So let's start with the XBRL report, the instance document. Remember, the traditional instance document is the machine-readable document that contains all the XBRL facts and tags. With iXBRL, the instance document and HTML document are merged into a single document that is filed with the SEC. Filers are no longer required to submit an instance document as a data file exhibit. However, once you file iXBRL and it is posted on the SEC's website, the SEC system will extract a traditional instance document from the iXBRL, and it will be seen under the data files list and will be labeled extracted. The SEC's iXBRL viewer tool can be used to view the instance document contents that have been merged into the HTML document. Each tag fact will have orange bars in the viewer to show users it has associated instance document metadata, which can then be clicked on and viewed. From the context of the human readable document, users are able to see all the XBRL attributes of a fact, such as definition, balance type, period type, dimensions, and accounting references. This is a very cool advancement in interactive data technology. Also, please note, as part of the iXBRL rule, as Mike said, filers are no longer required to post their XBRL file set to their company's website. And so what has changed? In addition to seeing the XBRL attributes in the iXBRL report, there are a few new features with new best practices to be aware of as you transition to iXBRL formatted documents. So first, hidden tags. Sometimes there will be tag facts that are not anywhere in the content of a 10K or 10Q document. For example, the CIK number for an entity. We will cover in detail what you need to be looking for when it's inspecting your iXBRL document for hidden facts. Duplicate amounts. Inline XBRL has a little more leeway for rounding financial figures. There are acceptable cases and other cases you will want to avoid. Transformations. These are new format attributes that connect the transformation of a fact from the human readable format to machine readable format. In the EFM, there is a new rule introducing transformation registries. Exclusions and continuations. These are new elements used in the iXBRL document to help ensure XBRL text blocks contain the correct and relevant content from the HTML document. Dimensions. In the inline viewer, users are able to more easily view dimensional tagging such as axes and members. However, they will look slightly different than when viewed in the traditional XBRL rendering. Again, these are major changes at a high level, and we will dive into in a moment. But first, what has not changed? Nothing changes in terms of tag selection or the tags that you have been using in your company's taxonomy schema compared with traditional XBRL. The tags are the same. Also, all the link bases are still required, meaning you will still have the presentation, calculation, definition, label, link bases as part of the iXBRL filing. The label captions are still required to match the base financial statements. And there are no changes to how negated, total, period start, period end label rules are used. When using custom company extensions, there are no changes. but please remember to follow the FASB US GAAP taxonomy style guide for structuring custom definitions. And yes, as I said, calculations are still required, but the inline viewer makes viewing the calculation structures much easier. All right, and now I'll pass it off to Michelle for a CPE question, and then we'll do a deep dive into the details of iXBRL best practices.
Brian, thanks so much. Yeah, we're actually going to jump. We're not going to do the CPE questions just yet. We're going to jump straight in.
Gotcha.
Those features of inline XBRL. I know we had a lot of moving parts in this webinar, so appreciate everybody's involvement. So we're going to go straight into the features of inline XBRL, and we're going to start with Anna Kwok from Workiva. Anna.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yes, and so on the topic of hidden facts, as Brian mentioned earlier, these are essentially XBRL facts that need to be included in the filings that are not being displayed directly in the document. And CIK is a classic example. Typically, that CIK number is not written on the document, but would be included in your XBRL facts. There could be other scenarios, such as there's a concept of transformation, because all your data points need to be tagged directly on the document. And there are new features that are basically enabling, that have been added to enable filers to tag more of that content directly in the document and have it be converted into the proper XBRL values. While these additional features have been added, it does not work for everything. So when the transformation is not available, that would be another situation when a hidden fact would be necessary. So now that we've talked about when to use the hidden facts and when should filers avoid using the hidden facts. So do keep in mind that because the inline tagging is exactly as the name suggests, all the tagging should be tagged directly in the document. Filers should avoid using hidden facts when the content can be tagged without using the hidden section. And we're going to look at an example of something like that next. And then we also want to pay attention to not include information that actually is not disclosed in the document. And so, you know, CIK is a required DEI information, but if you have other disclosures that were actually not provided in the document, you would not be adding them to the hidden section. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so what do hidden facts look like? What we have on the screen here is the inline viewer or the inline display of the tagged iXBRL document. And you might notice on the upper left-hand corner there's a drop down under data that essentially are, you have options to choose what XBRL data you want to visualize. And if you choose the option additional items only, on the right-hand panel there is basically the panel displaying your XBRL facts. If you choose additional items only, it would display all the XBRL facts that do not appear or that are not displayed directly on your document. And so we talked about example like the CIK, or for example, the document fiscal period focus, where you actually say Q1, and that's typically not directly entered in your document. And then there is another example on the next slide. And that is like, for example, the exchange name. Now, exchange name can usually be tagged inline without the use of hidden section. The example here is where the New York Stock Exchange, for example, the proper XBRL value would be NYSE, and there are transformations included for a couple variations of how that exchange name may appear on your cover. But to the extent that you might have a variation that is not included in the transformation, and that might be a scenario where you would then include the NYSE in a hidden section and in order to include that in your XBRL facts. And the next example, we have another example of expected hidden facts. And so in this example, it is a disclosure for your open tax year. And in your document, the disclosure appear as 2014 and forward. And for this particular XBRL element, if you look at the box in the middle there, the lowest item type is a G year list item type. So that item type actually calls for the listing of the years as appear in that green box under the XBRL fact. So the XBRL fact value is actually displaying the content of 2014, 2015, 2016, 17, 18. And so that would also be an example of expected hidden fact, because that's just not how that content was displayed in the document. And the next slide, we have an example of an unexpected hidden fact. And this particular example is about a checkbox on the cover page for a shell company. So whether you indicate by check mark whether the registration is a shell company. And in the example, the answer would be no or false. But what we're showing here, a fragment from the document, is that it's not actually tagged inline. The proper tagging would be, if you look at the example under the title, proper inline tagging, is that you'll notice that there are two red lines above the empty box next to yes, or around the checkbox next to yes, indicating that that's actually a checkbox that was tagged inline. And that was, again, because there's a transformation for converting an empty box to the value false. And that would enable filers to actually tag that data point directly inline on the document versus using a hidden section. There's going to be more a deeper dive into transformation covered by Steve next. So we're not going to go into a lot of details there, just a couple of examples of what might be expected hidden tagging versus unexpected. All right, and so just to recap the best practices on hidden facts, that is number one, you want to use hidden facts when the required XBRL data points do not have a corresponding tax value in the filing itself, or the content is in the filings but does not have the proper transformations to convert it to the correct XBRL fact value. And it is important to develop a process to review the hidden facts and make sure that you ascertain the reason as to why they have been included in the hidden section. And this will involve, an understanding of what are the available transformations, for example, which again will be covered in more details later on.
Hey, Anna, before we move on to your next section, we did have a question that pertains to hidden facts. And the question is, can we tag any fact values in the hidden section except DEI elements? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I think it's, how do you handle DEI elements versus non-DEI elements in terms of hidden
yeah, so without getting super technical about what is considered, like DEI, because like the EFM actually does make that distinction. And in fact, certain DEI items are not necessarily IX hidden. And I think the example that we looked at earlier on the open tax year would be an example that is actually not a DEI disclosure, and but it would be included in as hidden facts. So the short answer to that question would be yes, there are proper scenarios for including disclosures in hidden facts that are not DEI items. It's just a matter of making sure that there is a valid reason for doing that.
Okay, great. And then the next question Also regarding hidden facts, what about a fact that is being disclosed with multiple dates? How would that be handled?
I'm sorry, Michelle, can you repeat that question one more time, please?
What about a fact that is being disclosed with multiple dates?
Yes, that's a good question. That is something that the inline features that support. You could wrap a single disclosed value with multiple facts, and so you should be able to do is detect that amount with the element, and then be able to essentially apply both dates and create two facts with that item.
Okay, great, great. Okay, I'll let you move on now. Okay, so I'll move to the next slide here for you.
Great, thank you. And then as far as duplicate amounts, so the concept of duplicate amounts, why it is new is because Brian explained earlier that in the traditional XBRL format, essentially it's a matter of a process to include all your disclosed information in the XBRL instance document, and so in that process, it used to be that if you have multiple usages of a disclosure item, you wouldn't include that in the instance document multiple times. With the implementation of inline, that was allowed, but there was also not necessary to do that. With the inline tagging requirement, which essentially covering tagging, all information in your financial statement and note, that created the requirement to tag the duplicate amount. And there are three types. Obviously, it could be an complete duplicate, meaning you have disclosed a value in more than one location in your document, and they are exactly the same. There's also this concept of consistent duplicate, which means that they might not be displayed identically, but they are rounded to a consistent value. And then you have the concept of an inconsistent duplicate, which essentially would be an XBRL error. And so we talked about, the requirement to include duplicate amount is essentially when a number is disclosed with the same level of precision or different level of precisions, which, for example, if an amount that's displayed in millions versus in thousands. And because inconsistent duplicate would be an XBRL error, that is when it should not be included. Duplicate fact is actually considered an XBRL error, and an XBRL error would, this XBRL error would cause Acker to suspend the entire submission within iXBRL. So that it would be a scenario where you would not include those duplicate amounts. So we're going to look at next an example of what a consistent duplicate look like. So as I mentioned earlier, it's very common that documents may include amount, multiple times, maybe in millions versus in thousands. So if you look at the amount in the paragraph up at the top there, it's 21.1 million, and its scale is in millions, and the decimals is in 100,000s because it's 0.1 million. And then you have the amount in the disclosure table below that is in thousands, it's 21,085 in thousands, by scale as well as in decimal. And so those two amounts will be considered consistent duplicate because they round to consistent values. And then next would be an example of an inconsistent duplicate where you have 21.0 million, and then the same amount in thousands, 21,085, and they would not round to consistent amount, and therefore would be considered duplicate fact error. And so just the last point here is that, as I mentioned, because it's a duplicate fact is an XBRL error, this is what the XBRL error might look like. It was, if you have inconsistent duplicates triggering this error, you would see a error message, but basically indicating that instance document contain an element that was used more than once, and that you need to ensure that there is no duplicate combination of concepts and contexts in the instance. Basically, you know, because what that might indicate is that you have tagged, you know, different data points with the same elements and same dates and whatnot. And so again, inconsistent duplicates would cause your filings to be suspended and should be fixed in your preparation process. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Michelle.
Great, Anna, thank you so much. That was great, really, really helpful. And we did get to a lot of the questions that were asked, and I'm gonna jump right now into CPE questions. And because this is a longer session than we usually have, we're gonna have 3 CPE questions. So hang on just a second while I bring up the poll. And again, you know, everybody knows the drill. For those of you who are getting CPE credit, you do need to answer these questions. So the first question is, when do accelerated filers need to comply with the SEC requirement to tag their financials using inline XBRL? Remember, this is accelerated filers. Is it with their first fiscal period beginning on or after June 15th, 2020? Is it with their first fiscal period beginning on or after June 15th, 2021? Or with their first fiscal period beginning on or after June 15th, 2022? Okay, I'll give you like another 30 seconds or so to respond to that question. Okay, just another 10 seconds here. Okay, we're going to move on to our next poll. Thank you for responding. Okay, per the SEC FAST Act, public company filers will need to tag information on the cover pages for which of the following forms? Is it first 10K, 10Q, 8K, 20F, 40F, and forms 3 and 4, or 10K, 10Q, 8K, 6K, 20F, 40F? Or is it the third option, 10K, 10Q, 8K, 20F, 40F? Kind of a mouthful. So just another 20 seconds or so. Okay, just another 10 seconds before we close down this poll. All right, I'm going to end the polling here. All right, and now we have our third question. Okay, to comply with the FAST Act, companies that have multiple states of jurisdiction should do the following. Should they provide an XBRL tag for every state on their cover page? Or option 2, provide an XBRL tag for only the company's state of incorporation? Or option 3, do not XBRL tag the state information on the cover page for companies that have multiple states of jurisdiction? Which do you think is the most appropriate answer? And we got another 30 seconds or so. Okay, just another 15 seconds to take care of this question before we move on to our next topic. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. All right, thank you everybody for responding to those. And now we're going to move to the next portion of our session. We're going to have Steve Horowitz from NovaWorks, who's going to first address transformations.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Michelle. We're talking about transformations. So transformations, what are they? Well, transformations are a set of formats you can apply to a value in your HTML that will convert what you see into a normalized value that the SEC is expecting. So it takes a set input and converts it into some sort of output. And a common question I get about this is, why do you need to use transformation to tag inline XBRL? And the real reason for that is because inline XBRL changes none of the requirements of regular XBRL. If regular XBRL is expecting a specific type of value to be tagged, you still have to have that specific type of value tagged, even if it looks different to the actual user when you're viewing it in the HTML file. So it might not be a very human readable format that the SEC is expecting with the XBRL, which is why you have to use a transformation to convert it into something that is a little bit more friendly to XBRL. And going along with that, when should filers use these transformations? Generally, you're going to want to use a transformation when you have a value that you want to tag, but the format that is expected in XBRL just is not user-friendly. And as an example here, we have, maybe you have the wording 1 spelled out as 1, but it is an integer value you're actually tagging. Therefore, there are transformations that you could use that would convert the cardinal wording 1 to an integer representation of 1. Or you might be converting a time period such as 10 years. And if you have to tag that, XBRL is expecting that in an ISO format. So you would have P10Y. So there are transformations available in XBRL where you could just highlight and tag the wording 10 years or just the letter, the numbers 10, and use a transformation to convert that into the appropriate ISO format. So really all it's doing is taking something you give it and converting it to something else that the SEC expects. So what does this look like when you look at it in the SEC's viewer? Well, the end user, when you look at it just on the overall viewer, you're going to see your file as normal. It'll look normal. It'll have the wording on there. And you can see here the word no is highlighted. So that word no represents 0. So it's a material fact. You have to tag it. It represents you have 0 trading securities. So it's tagged, but you're using a transformation to convert it from the word no into the actual integer value of 0. That way it is useful XBRL data instead of just the word no, which is not super useful. So when you click on it and view it in the viewer, it will show a 0 because it's being transformed into 0 by this XBRL formatting. So what are some common types of transformations? Transformations are actually used a lot more frequently than you would think. They're not just on things like what we talked about before, where you're transforming dates, you're transforming words into integer values. Almost every fact has some sort of transformation. And most of the time this is handled under the hood by your software that's creating the XBRL. You generally don't have to worry about it. But some extremely common ones you'll see if you actually look at the underlying XBRL are things like num.decimal. This will convert a number that has like commas or formatting in it into just a regular integer value with no commas, no formatting, like 1,234 with a comma converts to 1234. And this is because the actual underlying XBRL is XML, and it's not expecting to have extra values like commas in there. It's expecting just the integer value. So in order for that to actually work, you have to transform it. And like I said, this is handled most of the time under the scenes, but it's still good to know. The other common transformations we have are 0 dash. This is really common. It converts a dash in your XBRL to a 0. This is converting it into a 0 instead of converting it into a nil fact. There are other transformations where if you want to have the dash handled as a nil fact, you can tag that as well. So another really common one, numword sen, converts a cardinal number like 3 to the integer 3. That's kind of like we just had in the previous slide as an example, where you're converting a word into an integer value that you can tag. So there are numerous specialized cover page transformations as well. One of the most common ones you'll see, Anna had it on her example, is a bool ballot box, which turns a checkbox into a true or false value. So this is something you generally would use on the cover page to tag. And I see we had a question come in, are the transformations a manual process? Generally, they're not usually. It's going to depend on your software vendor. A lot of the time it is handled for you by your software you're creating the XBRL with. But in some cases, you are going to have to go ahead and specify which transformation you're going to use. That's going to be vendor by vendor.
Hey, Steve, I think that Mike wanted to say a few words on transformations.
Oh, sure.
Did I get that correct, Mike?
No. I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think he was just marking it as answered live,
Apologies.
so
I was
okay.
just marking it. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I actually have another question for you.
Sure.
Steve. So, and this one just came in. Is there a transformation to tag the word not? How can we tag it?
That is a really good question. There are transformations that will turn any value into false. So you could definitely transform the word not into a just true false value or a true value. There are transformations that would do that as well. If you want to convert not into a 0 though, that might not exist. I'm not sure if it does or not. You might have to use a hidden fact or something if transformation does not exist. But yeah, if you're trying to convert into a true false value, there definitely are transformations that could do that.
Okay, great. Okay, those are the questions. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, if you can go to the next slide, please. So there are a lot of transformations that are available. This is obviously not a comprehensive listing of all of the transformations, but you can see here that there are quite a few of them. You can transform all sorts of different wording to different outputs, wording to different dates. You can transform anything to true, anything to false. So as we're looking at this, what are some of the best practices we can talk about with transformations? You're going to want to use the transformations listed in the Edgar Filer manual or in the specified registry wherever possible. So not only are there Edgar transformations, there are just base ones that come with iXBRL. And you can use either one in iXBRL to do your transformations. And one other thing to keep in mind when you're doing transformations, Anna mentioned hidden facts. There are two kinds of hidden facts you can do. There are the hidden facts she was referencing where there's no actual visible tag in the document anywhere. And that gets put into the IX hidden section. It's not referenced anywhere. It's just a plain hidden fact. There's also a reference hidden fact where you can tag something as a hidden fact, but reference its location in the actual document. So if you're going to be tagging something and there is no transformation for it and you need to tag it as a hidden fact, make sure when you do tag it, you tag it as a hidden fact that references a specific point in the document. That way it'll show up in the viewer as a tagged fact when you click on it, you'll be able to actually view it, as opposed to a regular hidden fact where it's just completely hidden and there's no physical representation in the actual visible document. So just keep that in mind when you're tagging things. And that's generally something your software can make obvious as you're tagging things, whether it's a hidden fact or just a regular hidden fact.
Great. Steve, we have another question on transformations about 0 dash. In what scenario is a filer required to convert these to nil or 0?
It's going to depend on what convention they're using in their financial accounting. I've definitely seen instances where a dash is counted as a 0. I've also seen instances where dashes are counted as nil values. I generally tend to think they're nil values, should be counted as nil, but I have definitely seen documents that do not handle them that way and handle them as zeros. So that is up to the individual filer what convention they're using.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it on the questions for now. Should I move to the next slide?
Yeah, please. So what if no transformation is available for my fact? If no transformation is available, it's sometimes possible to use inline CSS to stylize the text so you can apply a transformation to it. For example, the jurisdiction on the cover page, if you have it in only like all caps, you actually can't tag it in all caps because the transformation is expecting to be initial caps. So it is expecting to be like a capital D Delaware with everything else in lowercase. If you want to show it, however, as all uppercase, you can use the CSS property text transform uppercase on the word Delaware, and then you can tag it again and transform it using this transformation. That way you're actually transforming the underlying HTML value while you have a different value being displayed to the user using this CSS style property. So it allows you to kind of show one thing and tag another stylistically, but it's still the same wording being tagged as Delaware. Your transformation can then apply, and that's all you really have to do there. And then what happens if you can't use a transformation because it's not a capitalization problem? Maybe it's something completely different. If you can't use a transformation at all and you still have to tag the fact, that's where you would want to use, like I said, a hidden fact. You would either have to use a hidden fact that references the point in the document where your value is tagged, or you would actually have to, change the visible wording of the document to match what the transformation is expecting as an input. And while we're talking about entity incorporation state country codes here, we did receive another question in here for the DEI element entity incorporation state country code. When using the enumeration XX or unknown, you can just put unknown as a state of or jurisdiction of incorporation, and the transformation should accept unknown as a valid value and transform it to XX in the underlying XBRL. So you just tag it as the expected value on the SEC's table, and they have a table on their website of all of the country codes they're accepting, and it will transform it into the actual code. So unknown is an acceptable value to put there. You just want to make sure it's capital U, everything else lowercase, otherwise the transformation won't work. So they are expecting pretty specific inputs. Okay, but if you could move to the next slide, please. Okay, continuations and exclusions. What are continuations and exclusions? So these allow us to stitch together different blocks of text in a document. With inline XBRL, when you're looking at the document in HTML, there might be extraneous information in there that you might not want to include in a text block. Things like page breaks or page numbers or header information that isn't really part of the text. So continuations allow us to stitch together different pieces. Continuations would be used to say this document, this table or note continues from this point to this point, and exclusions kind of do the inverse, where it says this specific object doesn't count as part of my tagged value. So you're tagging the whole thing and saying, no, this piece doesn't count, and this piece doesn't count. So what do these look like? You can see right here an example where you have a section of excluded text. So this is either tagged as number 2 operating and reporting segments as one block and then a continuation below as part of it, or you could tag the whole thing as one block and then just mark the page break and page number with exclusions to say it's excluded from this block. But both would achieve a similar result where it's, in this case, it looks like a continuation, but an exclusion could do the same thing. You're just saying what piece you're leaving out. So best practice with this, the key takeaway from here is you do not want to exclude things that should be included in the document. So if it's part of your note that you should include, don't exclude it. Don't use these to not tag something. And you're going to have a review process that goes through and requires, verifies that all required text is actually tagged. Just because it looks like it's tagged in the actual document doesn't mean it is. You have to actually click on it or view it in the interactive data viewer in order to verify the actual tagged value is. Okay. Going a little fast here, but we are running short on time, so I just want to make sure we get to everything. So what are dimensions? They haven't changed. Inline XBRL dimensions are the same as regular XBRL dimensions. The only difference is in how they're displayed. You're going to tag things with the same level of dimensioning. It's still the same requirements. So whatever review process you're using for verifying dimensions in regular XBRL, you're going to have to keep that process. You can use the SEC's viewer to augment that process, or you can still use the traditional viewer to view it in your current process. Let's take a look at how that looks in the viewer. If you go to the next slide, please. So here's an example of a tagged balance sheet value. If you click on the value, you can see the full fact value as well as what axis and members are attached to that. So this tells us that our number 833,000 is tagged as a segment business reporting axis or statement business segment axis, and it has a member for Lennar Home Building East. Go on to the next slide. You can also use the filters available in the inline viewer to only show elements of a certain axis. That way, if you want to review this and check to see which axes are used where, you can filter to only display those axes on your report. So it is a nice and quick tool to review to make sure your tags are with the appropriate dimensions on them in the viewer.
Hey, Steve, we have a question about what are extensible tags and when should they be used?
So extensible tags, I'm not sure from the context of the question, but it's probably talking about extension elements, I would imagine. An extension element should only really be used if you're looking for a concept that doesn't exist within the current taxonomy or might be very specific to your business. In that case, you would use a custom extension element. But for the most part, you should try to find your elements in the actual SEC taxonomy. It's usually pretty comprehensive.
Great, thank you. Let's move to, should I move to the next slide?
Yes, please. So this is a traditional view of iXBRL, which you're probably more familiar seeing it in this tabular layout, but it gives another representation of a similar balance sheet style data. Not balance sheet, this is segment reporting. But you can see here that you have Lennar Home Building as a context with date values, and you can see it as a table. And it's just another view of showing the same style of information where you'll be looking at dimensional data, but this way we're looking at it as the more familiar table with traditional iXBRL. But it's another way of representing the same data, just a different format. Okay.
Steve, thank you. Actually, we did get one clarification on that question. That individual who asked that question said extensible tags from an extensible list. I'm assuming that he means enumerated extensions or extensible extensions.
Yeah, from extensible tags from an extensible list. Yes. That is a good question. There aren't too many uses for that in the current taxonomy. I know they're expanding that going further, but I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question.
Well, if I could just direct that individual who is anonymous here we had a webinar with the FASB a few weeks ago where they spoke specifically about extensible enumerations and how they're going to be incorporated in the 2021 taxonomy. So that might be a good one to check out when you have time, because you can just look at listen to the archive up on our website. So Steve, thank you so much. That was really informative and helpful, and I did a great job. And I think we're now going to switch gears and move back to Brian Chavez from Donnelly Financial Solutions, who's going to give us a kind of a summary of best practices and lessons learned.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, we've gone through a lot of the iXBRL details and best practices, so let's discuss how to prepare. As a recommendation, we suggest you plan ahead so that your company can make a smooth transition to the new iXBRL rule. Begin the discussion with your provider as soon as possible. As we've said, every provider or software application will have a unique transition. Remember, each filer category has different timelines to comply with the iXBRL rule, and accelerated filers must comply on or after June 15th of this year. If you are a non-accelerated or smaller reporting company or other, you can always transition to iXBRL earlier than the SEC's timeline. We highly recommend doing a trial run before your compliance date. We've discussed a lot of new features in iXBRL, such as hidden facts and transformations, which will need to be reviewed before you file. So make sure you have adequate time to review these new items. And use the SEC's iXBRL viewer as part of your review process, because this is how the public will see your filing. For peace of mind that your iXBRL conversion has been implemented correctly, we also suggest doing a comparison of your previous traditional XBRL filing to the iXBRL's extracted instance document before filing iXBRL. And next slide. All right, and then consider these potential process changes to ensure you have your iXBRL review covered. Completeness check. How have you historically checked the XBRL for completeness? Well, with iXBRL, it is easier now in the inline viewer because you can see if a fact is tagged or not. Have you been utilizing the accounting references to assess the accuracy of a tag selection? Be sure to review the references given for elements. These references can easily be viewed in the inline viewer for each tagged item. How have you been reviewing dimensions? Remember, dimensions will look a little different in the inline viewer compared to traditional XBRL rendering, but in my opinion, it's a little bit easier to understand in the iX viewer. There's no flow through. Overall, the inline viewer makes viewing the tagging data easier. Consider using it to review all tagging attributes, including balance type, decimals, units, and dates. Oh, and don't forget the Data Quality Committee DQC rules. Each iXBRL document should always be validated against these rules before filing. Next slide, please. So how complex is the actual conversion to inline XBRL? Well, as we've discussed, it depends on your software solution you are using. Are you using a new application and doing the tagging yourself, or are you outsourcing the tagging and primarily reviewing? Every iXBRL solution and application will have its own variables, so it's critical to begin these conversions and steps with your service provider as soon as possible. Some key questions to be asking your service provider. Will there be a change in turnaround times? Of all the new features and attributes that we've reviewed today, such as hidden facts, transformations, continuations, exclusions, who's responsible for ensuring the best practices that we've discussed today are followed? And then, do I need to train my people to do anything different in my quarterly review process? Remember, these are important questions to get answers to as soon as possible. And always remember to test file and check the accession messages for errors and warnings. This concludes today's inline XBRL presentation, and I think Michelle has a few final CP questions.
Great, Brian, thanks so much. That was great, really helpful. And actually, we did get a clarification on the extensible enumerations from Louis Mathern with the FASB. He just wanted to note to everybody that the US GAAP and SRT taxonomies include 282 extensible list elements. Starting with the 2021 release, these will all be converted to conform to the XII specification for extensible enumerations 2.0. And again, you know, the FASB went through this in great detail in a webinar that we held with them a few weeks ago, and David Shaw did a great job outlining the changes. And if you're interested, that's a good thing to go back and take a look at. So now I know we're running short of time, and I wanted to get to our CPE questions. So thanks for sticking around. For those of you in particular who are getting CPE credit, you want to make sure that you respond to these questions. So the first question that we have here is, which of the following statements related to the new SEC requirements on inline XBRL is correct? Is it number one, the inline XBRL submission replaces the HTML or text version and the XBRL version of their financial statement? Or two, companies will now be required to post their iXBRL filing on their company website? Or three, SEC filers will need to submit an additional XBRL instance document that contains data such as company CIK and security exchange name. So I'm going to give you another 20 seconds or so to respond to this poll question. And we did get a lot of questions. I appreciate everybody's questions, and I think we addressed most of them. If there are some that we missed, we'll come back and try to take a look at those. Okay, so I'm going to close this poll, and we go to our next poll. Okay, so which of the following is not a new feature of inline XBRL? Hidden facts, dimensions, continuations, or transformations? Which of the following is not a new feature of inline XBRL? Okay, so just like another 30 seconds or so. Okay, just another 10 seconds. And we just have one more poll question. I know it's a lot this time, but we do have, this is a longer session and you get 1.5 CPE credits. Okay, gonna end that one. Okay, and our last poll question for the day is which of the following are best practices to follow when working with hidden facts? Is it 1, use XBRL tags for hidden facts that have transformations? Is it 2, use hidden tags to include additional disclosures not provided in the document? Or 3, develop a process to review all hidden tags and document the reason for including them in the hidden section? Which of these is a really good best practice to follow? Okay, we've got another 30 seconds here. Okay, well, while we're waiting to finish up here, I want to thank everybody for doing such a tremendous job on the session today. We had Chase Bongiorno from Topan Merrill, Brian Chavez from Donnelly Financial Services, Steve Horowitz from NovaWorks, Anna Kwok from Workiva, and Mike Willis from the SEC, and a lot of really good information shared, and hopefully it was helpful to everybody. That's the end of that poll. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that we do have another session coming up next week, believe it or not, on a similar topic. This is going to be taking a kind of a deeper dive into cover page tagging for phase 2 filers. And so we encourage you to join us for that session, and it's going to be building on what you learned in the session today. And that one's just going to be 60 minutes. But thanks again for attending, and thanks again to our speakers and XBRL US members, and we really appreciate your support. Thank you. Bye now.